From an ethics of principle to an ethos of the urgent. Quoting Franz Kafka, "In the duel between yourself and the world, act as seconds to the world." According to classical tradition, philosophy is the dialogue of the soul with itself. This assumes that the soul is not unanimous, but feels a rupture in itself, where the conversation partners of this self-dialogue face each other within the interior. Conversation with ourselves can give us the bizarre yet everyday experience that one part of ourselves gets ahead of us while another is left behind. The state of tension that constitutes the psychological premise of self-reflection is what colloquial language calls having a conscience. The conscience that makes itself felt is eo ipso a conscience that is in tension with de facto existence. If individuals form a conscience that lets itself be felt, they are ahead of their own reality and can at least occasionally have something that we call a philosophical self-dialogue. Traditionally, the emotional instance that stirs as conscience is perceived as the innermost voice, as that which is my innermost. However, it can only appear because it behaves towards me as if it were something superior to me, although coming from me, that precedes my problematic factual essence. Only insofar as I am not only identical to myself but also superior am I capable of the kind of self-dialogue where the masterful voice of conscience converses with the babble of affects, calculations, and interests. Conscience functions as a cybernetic or hegemonic organ of the soul that relates the real states of conscious life to the highest terms of self-regulation, in short, to moral ideas. If there is now talk in Bonn about the credible embodiment of principles in politics, then this formulation borrows from the conscience model from classical moral philosophy. It suggests that the political subject can orient itself not only in its intimate self-perception, but also in its worldly actions according to the scheme of self-conversation, a conversation where the individual consciousness is at once both disciple and master. The conscience would then not only be the auto-communicative regulating instance in the individual's inner dealings with themselves, but also at the same time the seat of a wisdom that is always ahead of all events in the outside world. The belief in political action according to principles makes the bold and only seemingly conventional assumption that there is something in the soul which has enabled it in principle to overtake not only itself but also the world outside. Consequently, consciences would not only be the internal instances of individuals, but also the regulative entities of their external dealings. We have to admit that this is a seductive idea because it promises an unwavering superiority of the highest organ of the soul over so-called reality. If valid, it would guarantee the possibility of surpassing not only one's empirical inner life, but also the course of the world as a whole. And thanks to a treasure of eternal principles, it would be ahead of it once and for all. This kind of autonomous conscience of principles would make us invulnerable against the shock of events and protect us from changes of circumstances. As the world rages on outside and spins uncontrollable in the vortices of mobilization, we can retreat into our inner citadel and immunize ourselves against the course of events by observing the universals that are permanently engraved in our reflective conscience. One can easily see where such noble speculation turns short-sighted, as short-sighted as it must be to attempt a suspension of thinking at the aesthetic stage before the atrocity of analysis has a chance to overwhelm it. If we critically analyze the phenomenon of conscience, it immediately becomes apparent that it cannot possibly be understood as an autonomous, internal, and world-superior magnitude. Admittedly, it may seem through imminent contemplation that the subject's fundamental features are forever ahead of any possible inner or worldly event. But we only grasp the decisive fact when we take into account that the appearance of conscience is itself an event in the world. This event is anything but random. It is not one coincidence among many others, but a dramatic incursion of conscience into the world that turns it into a world for conscience. But this occurrence does not render all further remote eventfulness of the world process irrelevant. A world that contains conscience and is known by conscience is precisely thereby more than a sample collection of events that can be dealt with according to principles of conscience. Since we are always first born into the world and cannot assume to be in the world forever, our world conscience cannot only live off what is innate to us, acquired by us, and brought in by us. To put it as shockingly as it indeed is, consciences are, in the first instance, not the self-relations of individuals, but self-relations of the world, despite the fact that we only consider individuals to be the ontological premises for such world self-relations. The world calls forth differently conscientious individuals at different times if its internal affairs need to regulate problems through the medium of individual consciences. Such formations of conscience can certainly fail, and they indeed do fail in an overwhelming number of cases. Among other reasons, they fail when individuals do not form any kind of real relationship to the world and refuse to individuate. That is typical in interested parties and peoples with end-user sentiments, for whom individuation must be the exception to the rule. But the formation of conscience as a relationship to the world also fails if individuals fixate on principles to let the urgent run aground on the fundamental. The key word here is, yet again, neoconservatism. What is it other than the mobilization of old principles against new sensibilities? What else does it provide than a cynical desensitizing against the imperative for new forms of conscience that have become crucial in the face of unprecedented dangers? It remains to be seen if social democratic and socialist parties will take part in such desensitizing under the guise of morality. These have always been the most strongly ambivalent political parties in these matters. On the one hand, because they reach relatively sensitively to the development of new practical imperatives, that is, part of their tradition, and the labour movement itself was such a new imperative. On the other hand, because, with their commitment to fixed principles and defined interests, they are always in danger of confining themselves within a closed camp. In this sense, the political moralism currently raging all over the world is the most guileful form of political blindness, because it thinks that being able to be happy with yourself is what it means to be compatible with the world. Of course, these considerations are aimed not at an immoral short circuit between a hopeless world and unscrupulous souls, but at the medial fixing of moving consciences and the self-regulation of the world. Even so, we have to conceive of the world as an intelligent and generous process which, who knows how, has the opportunity to mean well with itself. Individual consciences would be the intelligent senses of the world that can use them to heal itself. The intelligent sensors. To be sure, there is no way to do justice to the phenomenon of life without taking into consideration an ontology of Munchausen syndrome. In the context of this syndrome, which is as astonishing as it is successful, new formations of conscience could be interpreted as the self-rescue agencies of the real. They could be the door to opportunity, so to speak, and danger would open it. The rescuing self-mediation of the world presupposes that the voice of conscience is precisely the voice of danger in which the world, through the medium of alert intelligence, sees itself. Only within this function is it still legitimate to speak of conscience. In all other cases, the moralizing conscientiousness that insists on itself creates a lack of conscience in its purest, most vicious form. The Vatican's stance on issues regarding birth control illustrates how this occurs. Nowhere else is the interpretation of an ontological self-rescue more magnificently formulated than in the couplet of Hölderlin's Patmos hymn. Where danger threatens, that which saves from it also grows. Frequently quoted and rarely understood, this phrase has become the slogan of a salvation philosophy, where the development of redemption is both tangibly and vaguely constructed as a quantitative mobilization of counterforces. But the growth of what saves from danger is actually to be understood as a reduction, namely a reduction of rigid subjectivity's resistance to the urgencies of the world process. What does grow when danger is understood is the subject's willingness to perceive danger's ecstatic and medial qualities. Growth of what saves presupposes the responsiveness of individuals to the as yet unspoken imperatives of danger. This is why an increasing attention to danger is a criterion of a politics that strives for a new kind of credibility for reasons that go beyond reputation. If danger is understood as the moment when new consciences are formed, then conscience is no longer just an instance of remembering general principles in the soul's conversation with itself. In its changed function, conscience is the ear for the urgent. If it merely listened to its own principles, there would be nothing but a cover name for the impenetrability of conscience and the self-gratification of the political conscience carriers. Conscience as ear says nothing. It allows for something to be said to it. There is far too much talk of morality and not enough listening. This is especially true in politics. But to learn how to listen, the actors of political praxis would have to take a step back from the deafening mobilisations that constitute the very catastrophe whose preventative measure they claim to be. In order to successfully strive for a new kind of credibility, the politician must become the medium of an urgency by which the world process works on consciences by overwhelming, provoking, and shattering them. As far as the embodiment of principles is concerned, the lack of credibility of politics is now its great opportunity. If political dealings are beginning to seem like a hollow spectacle, it would be a disaster if we plugged these new hollow spaces up with old principles. Very little separates hollowness from being receptivity. Only when the primacy of receptivity also permeates the political world can a politics with an ear towards the inevitable become conceivable. A politics that listens would not be windbagging in the service of interest groups, the medial relationship to the urgent in an ecstasy. In it, individuals constitute of more than just their interests, and the world is more than its sorry state of affairs. This presents an intriguing prospect for politicians as well. With a little luck, they could become credible contemporaries if they became the authors, and not just the targets of the satire that is sure to be written regardless.